The fog was thick enough to taste sour, heavy, clinging to every breath as the crew's van wound up the narrow road toward the hollow. The GPS had long since given up, and even the air seemed to resist their intrusion. Trees leaned inward like old men eavesdropping, their branches skeletal and trembling in the wind. At the end of the road, half swallowed by vines and silence, stood the farmhouse, a slumped relic of wood and rot, sagging under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. Inside, the smell was the first thing to strike them, a blend of decay, rain, and something sweeter, like spoiled fruit. Flies buzzed around the windows, their wings catching slivers of pale light. In the corner of the living room sat Mary Lou. Her hair hung in clumps, her skin grayish and soft like damp paper. She looked up as they entered, her eyes a milky blue that seemed to stare through rather than at them. "You come for the story," she croaked, her lips trembling into a smile that was not quite human. They didn't answer right away. The camera whirred, the boom mic caught the crackle of the fire, and outside, thunder rolled low and slow like a warning. Mary Lou's gaze drifted to the old rocking chair beside her. It rocked once, twice, then stopped. "He said he'd come back," she whispered. "He always does when someone says my name." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, the youngest, stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Who comes back, Mary Lou?" The old woman tilted her head, her smile widening as the wind howled through the broken window. "My papa," she said softly. "He raised me, loved me, and when Mama died, he said family should never be apart." She leaned forward, her breath sour and warm. "And so I stayed his, forever." The lights flickered, and from somewhere deep within the house came a low, dragging sound, something moving, slow and deliberate. The air grew colder. The camera's red light blinked once before dying completely. That was the last clear frame they would ever capture, Mary Lou's face lit by lightning, her eyes shining with the reflection of something just behind them. Something old. Something waiting. The road into the Appalachian Hollow felt like it had never been meant for outsiders. The deeper the documentary crew drove, the narrower it became, coiling between trees that seemed to close in as if to protect something buried in the mountains. Their headlights sliced through mist so thick it looked alive, curling around the van and swallowing sound. They were there chasing whispers, the kind of story no network wanted to touch but every filmmaker dreamed of uncovering, a family hidden from the world, bound by bloodlines too tangled and too dark to understand. Locals had spoken of them in half-sentences and lowered voices, always ending with a warning not to go near the house where the blood never thinned. The crew thought it was folklore, a macabre exaggeration of mountain isolation, until they found the first clue, a police report from the 1950s about a girl born without a birth certificate, without a father listed, but with a grandfather who refused to let anyone near her. As they climbed higher, radio signals cut off, cell phones died, and even the air felt heavier, damp with an old sadness that seemed to seep from the soil. The crew's leader, Nathan Cole, a skeptic by nature and journalist by training, brushed off the unease that tightened everyone's stomachs. He had made a career exposing rural myths and unearthing truths behind them. But this was different. The further they went, the more it felt like the mountains were swallowing them whole. On the last stretch of dirt path, they found an old wooden sign barely legible under moss, reading simply Hollow Creek, private land. There were no fences, no mailboxes, no signs of life except a crow perched on a post, its eyes fixed on the van like it had been waiting. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving everything in a bruised blue haze. The farmhouse appeared as if grown from the earth itself, slumped and crooked, its roof half collapsed and its windows blind with grime. A single chimney exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke, proof that someone, or something, was still inside. The crew stepped out, cameras ready, their boots sinking into the mud that smelled faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. The wind carried a sound that could have been a child humming, faint and off-key, vanishing as soon as they tried to locate it. Nathan turned to the others, forcing a confident smile, though his eyes betrayed him. Somewhere in that house was the story they came for, but as they approached the sagging porch, every instinct screamed that they should have never come at all. The front door groaned open with a sound like a long-forgotten breath, and the smell that poured out was almost physical, damp wood, rot, and something sickly sweet beneath it. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the weak light that filtered through cracks in the boarded windows. The crew hesitated on the threshold, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. Nathan pushed on, his flashlight beam catching glimpses of peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and old photographs hanging crooked on the walls. Faces stared back at them from those pictures, their eyes pale and blurred with age, yet somehow still watchful. One photo near the stairs showed a young girl standing beside an old man, her expression blank, his hand gripping her shoulder a little too tightly. The signature at the bottom read Mary Lou, 1949. A faint creak came from upstairs. Everyone froze. The sound repeated, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing just out of sight. Nathan called out, but no one answered. They climbed the staircase cautiously, each step threatening to collapse beneath them. The air grew colder the higher they went. At the end of the hallway, a door stood half open, flickering light spilling from within. When they pushed it open, they found her, an elderly woman sitting in a rocking chair by the window, her hair tangled and white, her body draped in a faded shawl. She turned her head slowly, revealing a face that seemed carved from wax, the skin soft and sagging, the eyes clouded but sharp in a way that made their stomachs twist. "You came," she said, her voice cracked but certain. "They always come when the ground gets restless." Her hands trembled as she gestured to a small table beside her. On it sat a collection of toys, rusted and broken, an old rattle, a headless doll, a wooden horse missing one leg. She picked one up and began to rock again, the chair creaking in rhythm with her whisper. "I kept them all. Every one of them." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether she was lucid or lost in her memories. Nathan introduced himself and explained they were filming a documentary about local families and lost histories. The woman smiled faintly, though the expression never reached her eyes. "Mary Lou," she murmured, tapping her chest with a bony finger. "Ain't no family left but me now." Her words seemed to echo in the stillness, carrying a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere deep in the house, something fell with a dull thud, and the rocking chair stopped mid-motion as Mary Lou turned her head toward the sound, her smile fading into something cold and knowing. The locals had warned them in their own quiet, cryptic way, but none of it prepared the crew for the weight of what they began to uncover about Mary Lou. At first, she seemed like just another forgotten soul clinging to the ruins of a past too painful to leave behind, but the stories whispered in the nearby town painted a picture far darker. The gas station attendant had said it first, his voice low and eyes fixed on the counter instead of them. "That's the girl who slept with her granddaddy." It sounded like an insult, something crude meant to scare outsiders away, but as more people spoke, the pattern emerged. No one laughed when they said it. No one smiled. The words came with fear, not gossip. When Nathan pressed for details, people fell silent or walked away. One old woman at the diner crossed herself and muttered that the family broke nature itself and that the mountain remembers. The sheriff refused to comment at all, only warning them to stay clear of the hollow after sundown. The more resistance they met, the more determined Nathan became to know who Mary Lou really was. He went through old records in the county archives, births, deaths, marriages, and that's when the horror began to take shape in ink and paper. There were no clean lines in her bloodline, no separation of names. Fathers were sons, mothers were cousins, and the same surnames appeared again and again across generations like an endless echo. One certificate in particular stood out, a child born to a 14-year-old girl named Mary Lou and a man listed only as John L. Whitmer, her grandfather. Back at the farmhouse, the weight of that discovery made the air seem thicker. Mary Lou was quiet when Nathan brought it up, her pale hands folding tightly in her lap. "People talk," she said softly, her voice more breath than sound. "They always have. But they don't understand what family means up here." The crew exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether to press further. Nathan did. "Was it true?" he asked, his tone careful but unrelenting. Mary Lou's eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, the room felt colder, as if the air itself recoiled. "He said it was love," she whispered. "He said blood keeps us safe. He said I was his beginning and his end." Her lips curved into a smile that didn't belong on any human face. Outside, a storm had started to roll through the hollow, and the walls of the house groaned under the wind's weight as if echoing the buried sins she had just unearthed. It was near midnight when one of the crew members, Sarah, found the diary. She had been filming close-up shots of the crumbling wallpaper and the old photographs when her foot caught on a loose floorboard near the hearth. The wood shifted, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth blackened with age, was a small leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and swollen from years of damp, and when she pried it open, the pages clung together as if they didn't want to be read. The ink had bled in places, but the handwriting was delicate and precise, the kind that belonged to another time. The first page bore a name: Lillian Whitmer, 1948. Mary Lou's mother. Sarah called the others over, and they gathered around the flickering lantern, the shadows of their faces twisting across the walls as Nathan began to read aloud. The entries started ordinary enough: notes about the farm, the changing seasons, and a baby that had just been born. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The words became desperate, fevered. "He says the world is wicked beyond these hills," one passage read. "He says the Whitmer blood must remain clean or the curse will come again." Another entry mentioned a promise made long ago, something about keeping the family together in flesh and in soul. The more they read, the more the language dissolved into madness. Lillian wrote of hearing voices in the walls at night, of her husband standing over their daughter's crib whispering prayers that weren't in any Bible. In one entry, the handwriting slanted violently, the letters almost clawed into the page. "He says she belongs to him now. He says she's the key to keeping the blood pure." Sarah's hands trembled as she turned another page. Tucked between them was a photograph: Mary Lou as a child, standing in front of the same farmhouse, her hair in braids, her eyes eerily empty. Behind her was an older man, tall and stiff, his hand resting on her shoulder just as in the photo by the stairs. But in this one, his face was half burned away, as if someone had tried to destroy it. Nathan closed the diary, his jaw tight, the air around them heavy with something unspoken. They could hear the faint scratching of branches against the window, though none of the trees were close enough to touch the house. "This isn't folklore," Sarah whispered. "This is ritual." As the fire sputtered low, the diary slipped from Nathan's hands and fell open again on the floor. The last page was smeared in something dark and dried, and beneath it, in a trembling scrawl, the final words read: "She will carry the promise when I am gone. She must never leave the mountain." That night, the house came alive in a way none of them could explain. The rain had started sometime after midnight, a slow tapping that grew into a steady drumming on the roof. The wind pressed against the windows like a living thing, making the old glass hum. The crew had planned to review their footage, but exhaustion and unease hung over them like a fog. Sarah was the first to notice the noise, a faint scratching that seemed to come from the walls. At first, she thought it was rats, but then came the whispering, so soft it was barely audible, like a voice trying to speak through the timber. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the words grew clearer, though still impossible to make out. When she called for Nathan, the sound stopped instantly, leaving only the creak of the old house shifting under the storm's weight. They gathered in the living room, the flicker of their lanterns painting warped shapes across the peeling wallpaper. Every few minutes, something moved in the dark edges of the hallways, shadows that shouldn't have existed, shifting in places where there was no light to cast them. The air smelled metallic again, and somewhere in the walls, a rhythmic thudding began, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat buried in the wood. One of the crew members, Liam, went pale and muttered that he heard a baby crying upstairs. The others fell silent. It was faint but unmistakable, the fragile, trembling wail of an infant. Mary Lou, who had been sitting motionless near the cold fireplace, lifted her head at the sound. "He's awake," she said softly, her lips curling into a smile that made everyone's skin crawl. "He always cries when strangers walk through the house." Nathan tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the sound grew louder, clearer, coming from the direction of the upstairs hallway. Liam, against the others' protests, took a flashlight and climbed the stairs, his boots echoing hollowly in the silence. The crying seemed to lead him on, pulling him toward a closed door at the end of the hall. When he opened it, the noise stopped completely. The rest of the crew waited below, tense and unmoving, until a loud crash shattered the stillness. Nathan ran up the stairs, shouting Liam's name, but the hallway was empty. The flashlight lay in the middle of the floor, still on, its beam aimed at the open doorway. The only thing inside was a crib, ancient, wooden, covered in dust. It rocked gently on its own, though there was no breeze, no movement, no sign of life. Nathan backed away, heart pounding, as the sound of the baby's cry began again, this time coming from directly behind him. By morning, the storm had passed, but the air inside the farmhouse felt heavier, like it had absorbed the night's terror. No one had slept. Nathan sat at the table with dark circles under his eyes, replaying the footage they managed to capture before the power died. The camera showed nothing unusual until it did. In the corner of one frame, as Liam walked toward the upstairs hall, a faint shape could be seen behind him, tall and gaunt, its outline trembling like heat rising from asphalt. When Nathan slowed the clip, the shape turned its head toward the lens, and though the face was little more than a blur, it seemed to grin. Sarah begged him to turn it off, but he played it again, staring at the image as if trying to prove to himself it wasn't real. When the sun rose high enough to bleed through the warped windows, they decided to check the barn. It stood a few yards behind the house, a collapsing structure overrun with weeds and rust. Liam's tracks in the mud led halfway there before stopping, as if he had vanished mid-step. The barn door hung askew, creaking as Nathan pushed it open. Inside, dust motes drifted through the shafts of sunlight that pierced holes in the roof. There was the faint smell of decay mixed with something chemical, like old bleach. Against one wall stood tools crusted with rust, hooks, saws, and blades that looked more like instruments of ritual than farming. As Sarah filmed, she noticed something carved into the door's interior. Dozens of strange symbols, circles intersected with jagged lines, covered the wood. Some were fresh, their edges sharp and splintered, while others had faded with time. Near the bottom, a single handprint was smeared in dark red, too small to be Liam's. Nathan traced the carvings with his flashlight, muttering that they looked like sigils, though none of them recognized their meaning. In the far corner of the barn, a piece of fabric caught on a nail fluttered weakly in the breeze. It was part of Liam's jacket. That discovery silenced everyone. They stood there, the camera still rolling, as the wind seemed to pick up without warning. The door slammed shut behind them, throwing the barn into shadow. Sarah screamed, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse in the dim light, the carved lines almost bleeding as the air grew colder. Nathan finally forced the door open, and they stumbled out, gasping in the daylight. When they looked back, the carvings were gone, every mark wiped clean, the door smooth as if untouched. In their place, scratched freshly into the wood, was a single word written in jagged letters, *stay. That evening, the weight of what they'd seen pressed on them like a living thing. No one spoke much as they huddled in the living room, lanterns dim, cameras left untouched. The silence between them carried the same unease as the air inside the house, thick, damp, full of whispers that came from nowhere. Marilou hadn't moved from her rocking chair all day. She sat facing the window, humming something tuneless and broken. Nathan finally approached her, exhaustion and dread warring inside him. "Marilou," he said softly, "we need to know what happened here. We need to understand." For a long time she didn't respond. Then she stopped rocking, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening to something far away. "You don't want to understand," she murmured. "Once you know, he knows too." Nathan pressed anyway, desperate for truth, for logic. "What did your grandfather do to you?" he asked. Her eyes moved to meet his, and for the first time, he saw clarity there, painful, sharp, and unbearably human. "He didn't just raise me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He remade me. Said we were chosen to keep what's pure. Said the mountain would die if our blood thinned." Her trembling hand lifted toward the ceiling, where faint creaks echoed as if someone or something was walking above them. "When Mama tried to run," she continued, "he said she broke the promise. He said she brought sickness. He buried her out by the creek so she could feed the roots that feed us." Sarah's camera trembled in her hands as she filmed. Marilou went on, her words unraveling faster, her tone shifting between sorrow and reverence. She spoke of nights when the walls moved like breathing skin, when her grandfather would call her name even after he was long dead, telling her to keep the blood strong. She said he had taught her things no child should know, made her repeat prayers in a language she didn't understand, made her promise that when the time came, she'd do the same. "But I didn't want to," she whispered. "I tried to stop it. I did." Her voice cracked. "But blood doesn't forget. It calls." The lantern flickered violently then, shadows crawling across the floor in shapes that didn't match their bodies. Nathan felt the temperature drop so suddenly it hurt to breathe. The sound of distant footsteps moved through the ceiling again, slow and deliberate, heavier than before. Marilou's eyes glazed over, her rocking chair creaking once more. "He's awake now," she said, smiling faintly. "You asked, and he heard you." By the next day, none of them could pretend this was just a documentary anymore. The air around the farmhouse seemed to hum with something unseen, an energy that pressed against their skin and made the walls feel alive. Nathan had spent the night poring over the footage again, searching for answers, but what he found only deepened the dread. In the background of multiple clips, ones filmed hours apart, the same faint shape appeared behind Marilou, sometimes by the window, sometimes in the hallway, always still, always watching. When he showed the others, Sarah began to cry quietly. None of them could explain how the figure had moved without being seen. It was Sarah who suggested they search the property again, desperate to find something that could make sense of it all. The morning mist had barely lifted when they found the entrance to the cellar, hidden beneath a warped section of floor in the kitchen. The hatch was nailed shut, the wood splintered and stained. It took Nathan and one of the sound techs nearly half an hour to pry it open. The smell that poured out was thick and foul, the kind that clings to you, rot, iron, and something sweet underneath it. A narrow set of steps led into the dark. They descended with flashlights, their beams slicing through the gloom, revealing stone walls slick with moisture. At first, it looked like any old cellar, shelves of preserves long since spoiled, rusted tools, and broken jars. But then Sarah's light caught something further back. Against the far wall sat an old wooden cradle, its paint long faded, its rockers worn smooth. It moved slightly, back and forth, as if stirred by a draft that didn't exist. Beside it, bones were scattered across the floor, small ones, too small. A chill swept through them all as Nathan knelt, realizing some were not animal remains at all. Above the cradle, photographs had been nailed into the stone, dozens of them, black and white portraits of children with wide, empty eyes. Some were duplicates, aged differently, as if someone had kept taking the same picture year after year. The walls were covered in markings, carved deep into the stone, the same symbols they had seen in the barn. But these were older, etched by hand, filled with something dark that flaked when touched. Sarah's flashlight flickered and went out. For a moment, only Nathan's remained, its beam catching on the cradle. It rocked harder now, as though responding to their presence. From somewhere in the shadows, a faint cooing sound rose, soft and wet, like a baby trying to breathe. Sarah screamed, and the sound instantly stopped, leaving only silence so thick it felt alive. When they climbed back up from the cellar, their faces were grey with shock and exhaustion. The daylight outside felt wrong, too bright, too colorless, like the world had tilted slightly off its axis. They gathered on the porch, silent for a long time, none of them able to speak about what they'd seen. Nathan tried to focus on logistics, on packing up the gear, on getting everyone out before dark. But Sarah just stared at him, her eyes red and hollow. "You don't get it," she said quietly. "We're not supposed to leave." The words chilled him, not because of what she said, but because of how certain she sounded. When he asked what she meant, she didn't answer. She just looked back at the house, her expression distant, as if listening to something only she could hear. Later, while reviewing a list of local records, Nathan noticed something strange. The surname Cole appeared in the archives, not from the past decade, but from nearly 80 years ago. A child born to Marilou's aunt, whose name was Eliza Whitmer. The father's name, written in faded ink, was unreadable, smudged beyond recognition, but the last name was clear enough, Cole. Nathan froze. It couldn't be coincidence. His hands shook as he flipped through more records, tracing the name across generations. Every few decades, it appeared again, like a mark that refused to fade. When he told Sarah, she looked at him with an expression that wasn't surprise, it was understanding. "I told you," she whispered. "That's why he let you come." Her voice trembled as she explained that the Whitmers didn't just keep to themselves for secrecy, they kept their bloodline looping, generation after generation, believing it carried a gift from the mountain itself. Anyone who left was said to weaken the chain, but those who returned, even unknowingly, were bound to it again. Nathan felt the air thicken, his stomach twisting as the truth sank in. His own family had roots here, buried deep beneath the soil of this cursed place. Marilou had been listening from her chair, her thin hands resting on her lap. "I knew you looked familiar," she said softly. "You've got his eyes. My papa's eyes." The words hit Nathan like a blow, his vision swimming. Sarah stepped back, whispering for him not to listen, but Marilou's tone turned almost tender, her smile trembling. "He called you home," she said. "He always brings the blood back. It's what he promised me." Nathan's breath caught as the wind outside began to howl again, the same low groaning sound from the night before returning, this time closer, almost at the door. The final night came with no warning. One moment, the world outside was still. The next, the wind howled through the trees like a voice mourning the living. Nathan and Sarah had decided to leave, though neither could say where they would go. The others had already fled hours earlier, their departure swallowed by fog. But the van wouldn't start. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died completely. Every attempt ended in silence. The air outside had turned thick and electric, the smell of rain mingling with something metallic. Marilou sat in the doorway, watching them with a calm that felt like madness. "You can't leave now," she whispered. "He's almost here." Her eyes reflected the lantern light in a way that made her look ageless, as if the years had been stripped away. Inside the house, the walls began to creak and groan, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of breathing. Nathan felt it vibrate through the floorboards. The rocking chair moved on its own again, slowly at first, then faster, slamming against the wall before stopping abruptly. From somewhere beneath the floor came a muffled sound, a dragging, scraping noise, as though something large was moving through the earth. Sarah grabbed the camera, hands trembling, her voice breaking as she whispered Nathan's name. But he couldn't speak. He was staring at Marilou, whose features were shifting in the lantern's flicker, her skin tightening, her mouth twisting into a smile that belonged to someone else. Then came the voice, deep and distant at first, rising from the cracks in the floor. It was a man's voice, old and commanding, repeating her name. Marilou. Each syllable made the walls tremble. She stood slowly, her body moving in jerks, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "His home," she said, almost lovingly. Nathan tried to drag Sarah toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle burned hot to the touch. The lights flickered out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint red glow from the camera's dying battery. In that light, Nathan saw the outline forming behind Marilou, tall, thin, and impossibly wrong, its hands stretching out of shadow. The smell of rot filled the air as a cold wind swept through the room. Sarah screamed, the camera dropping to the floor, its lens capturing the last image. Marilou's face, smiling as something stepped through her, as if her body were only a doorway. Nathan's voice was heard once more, a choked whisper lost in the static. Then the feed cut to black. The farmhouse stood silent again, the storm fading, the mountain returning to stillness, as though it had simply taken back what it had always owned.